"Get out," my father said. Voice flat as the deadbolt he was already sliding into place. "You wanted the Navy, let the Navy house you?" He pointed at the door like it was a firing line. He meant it, entirely. My name is Daniela Chavez, and I was standing in my parents' foyer in service khakis. My bag was the same one I carried on deployment, scuffed at the corners. Heavier somehow when my mother wouldn't meet my eyes. She stared past me, at the family portraits, at the life I was supposed to live and didn't. The hallway clock ticked like a metronome, keeping time on my humiliation. I didn't argue. I had trained myself to breathe through storms, to speak only when the deck stopped tilting. The tiles were cold under my boots. A magazine slid off the hall table and fanned across the floor. A glossy spill of rooms I was no longer welcome in. I wanted to ask my father why a missed promotion made me worthless. I wanted my mother to say my name once, just to steady me. Instead, I lifted my bag and stepped toward the porch light. Outside, the Alabama night was thick and sweet, heat that clung to my collar. Cicadas buzzed. A sprinkler stuttered to life. I moved past the hedges I used to trim, past the mailbox with our family name in brass. The curb was higher than I remembered. Or maybe I was just tired. At the car, I set the bag in the trunk and waited for my hands to stop shaking. The porch light clicked off. The driveway fell into shadow. I stared at the dark house, felt the burn of it, and let it live. Then I turned the key and drove toward the gate. The truth is, the brake didn't start that night. It had been splintering for years, in ways I pretended not to notice. My family was built on expectations polished to a shine prep schools, business internships, weekends at country clubs. My brother slid into that rhythm like it was second nature. I never did. I was the kid who hated brunches and charity luncheons, the one who slipped away to read in the garage while my father held court about quarterly profits. He used to laugh it off when I was younger, call me stubborn. But the laughter soured as I grew older. By the time I was 16, it wasn't endearing anymore. It was a defect. When I told them I wanted the Navy, my father didn't even look up from his paper. He muttered something about people who couldn't hack it in the real world. My mother tried to soften it, but she didn't fight for me. That silence cut deeper than his words. Boot camp was brutal, but it was mine. Standing on that parade ground in uniform, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see I'd built something worth respecting. They didn't show up. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the ache in my chest was just fatigue. Over the years, every phone call home was a negotiation. If I mentioned deployments, my father dismissed them as long vacations on taxpayer money. If I mentioned commendations, he'd change the subject. My brother's promotions in the family business filled every conversation. My name was barely a footnote, so when the promotion board passed me over, I knew exactly how my father would use it. A single crack was all he needed to collapse the whole house of cards I'd tried to balance. He called me a failure with the same calm certainty he used to sign contracts. Still, I hadn't expected him to throw me out. That was the part I kept replaying as I lay awake in my rack aboard the ship that night. His hand pointing to the door, my mother's eyes fixed on the carpet, the word reject hanging in the air like smoke. I told myself the ship was my home now, steel, salt, and silence. But even as the engines hummed me to sleep, I couldn't quiet the thought if family couldn't see me. Who would? And yet, the next dawn on the water carried a strange promise that what they discarded might just be what I needed to begin. The morning after, I went through the motions like nothing had cracked open inside me. The ship's corridors smelled of diesel and coffee, the same comfort they always carried. But my body felt heavier, like every step belonged to someone dragging chains. I sat at my desk, flipping through readiness reports, pretending not to hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. By mid-morning, the executive officer called me into her office. She studied me longer than usual, her eyes sharp, but she didn't ask about the shadows under mine. Instead, she told me the board's results had come back. I wasn't selected. Her voice was steady, almost kind. but the words landed like stones in my chest. Then she paused, leaning forward. There's another opening. Unconventional. Humanitarian operations off the East African coast. Dangerous work, but high impact. You'd deploy next month. I didn't hesitate. My yes came out firmer than I expected, like it had been waiting in my throat all night. She nodded, almost like she'd known I would say it. Later, I called my mother. She answered quickly, voice clipped. I told her I'd be deploying again. There was no gasp, no word of pride, not even worry, just silence. And then, take care of yourself. That was all. The weeks blurred with briefings and medical checks, with drills that kept me too busy to think about the quiet ringing in my ears. Our detachment was small, a mix of Navy and Marines, all hardened, competent. They didn't know my story. They didn't need to. Out there, I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't a disappointment. I was an officer. And as the plane lifted off the runway, the lights of home shrinking into nothing, I realized I hadn't left behind family. I had left behind the version of myself still waiting for them to see me. Ahead was something different, unforgiving, unpredictable, but mine to claim. The heat slammed into me the moment we stepped off the transport plane. It wasn't the damp warmth of Alabama summers. It was a furnace, dry and relentless, carrying dust that clung to the skin and refused to let go. Our forward base was nothing glamorous canvas walls, corrugated metal roofs, generators that hummed all night. But I found an odd comfort in its starkness. There was no room for illusions here, no expectations beyond the work. Every dawn, I joined coordination calls with local agencies, then moved straight into planning convoys and airdrops. We worked until our voices cracked and our hands ached from writing reports in the stifling heat. I didn't complain. The exhaustion was clean, honest. It drowned out the echo of my father's words far better than silence ever could. 2 months in, the call came that changed everything. A civilian vessel, an NGO ship carrying medical supplies, had been hijacked off the coast. Command wanted it retaken, fast, and without harm to the crew. I wasn't SEAL qualified, but as the liaison, I was tasked with coordinating the moving parts. The night of the operation, I sat in a cramped command unit, headset tight against my ears, eyes fixed on drone feeds. My voice had to be calm, precise, unshakable, even as adrenaline thudded in my veins. Team 2, hold, wait for the corridor, go now. The words felt like steel in my mouth. Minutes stretched like hours. Then confirmation. Hostages freed. Supplies secured. No casualties. When the report came in, my hands shook. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of relief. The crew called it a miracle. I called it a good day. Weeks later, I was handed a letter recommending me for a commendation medal. I folded it quietly, tucked it away. The medal didn't matter. What mattered was the simple truth I hadn't broken. Not when they cast me out, not here, under fire. And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. Back in the States, I thought the mission would fade into the background like so many others. Just another classified report gathering dust. Instead, a Navy media team stitched together clips of the rescue. Somehow, I became the face of it, my voice calling commands over the radio, my image framed against glowing screens. The video spread faster than I was ready for, 500,000 views in a week. Strangers stopped me on base, nodding, saying, "Good work, ma'am." I didn't know how to answer. One morning, I opened my inbox and froze at the sender's name, my father. The message was one line. Saw your video. Surprised. Call if you want. I didn't call. Not because I hated him. Not because I needed him to say more. But because I finally didn't need his approval to breathe. Still, the ache lingered, late at night. I found myself staring at the email, imagining what I'd say if I did dial the number. My fingers hovered over the keys more times than I'd admit. Each time, I shut the laptop and walked away. Work filled the silence. I was reassigned to officer training programs, asked to share lessons from the field, standing in classrooms, watching young officers scribble notes. I realized the mission had changed me. I wasn't just proving myself anymore. I was shaping others. That responsibility steadied me in a way nothing else had. Then came the orders I never expected: executive officer billet on a guided missile destroyer. Second in command. One step from the top. When I boarded the ship for the first time, the steel beneath my boots felt like an answer I'd been waiting for. The crew eyed me carefully, some with doubt, others with curiosity. I didn't try to win them over with speeches. I showed up before dawn, stayed until lights out, worked alongside them in drills and inspections until the skepticism began to crack. Each order I gave wasn't just about readiness. It was a vow to myself. I wasn't a reject. I was exactly where I was meant to be. Life as an executive officer was nothing like I imagined. It wasn't just strategy or issuing commands. It was the weight of knowing every decision rippled through 200 lives. The crew tested me at first. Subtle challenges, a sarcastic comment in the mess, a delayed response during drills, the sideways glance that said, "You're too young for this." I didn't argue. I showed up. I walked the decks at night when others slept, checked compartments myself, learned every sailor's name until they realized I wasn't leaving. Then came the storm. Midway through a readiness exercise, one of our systems failed under pressure, threatening the entire drill. Officers scrambled, voices tangled, and for a heartbeat the ship felt like it was unraveling. I forced my voice to stay steady. Reset the board. Reroute through secondary. Breathe. We're not done. It wasn't heroic. It was calm. And in that calm, the ship found its footing again. Word traveled faster than I expected. Suddenly, I wasn't just tolerated, I was trusted. The crew didn't clap or cheer. They just moved differently around me, steadier, sharper, as if my presence meant they could hold the line. That was worth more than any medal. Still, the silence at home gnawed at me. My brother posted photos of corporate galas. My parents smiled beside him in tailored suits. My name was never mentioned. Even after the Navy released a carefully worded press piece about our success at sea, there was no call, no note, no trace of recognition. One night, after an exhausting round of evaluations, I returned to my quarters to find a package waiting. No return address. Inside was a single photo of me, mid-briefing, eyes narrowed at a monitor. Beneath it, written in thick pen, "You didn't break. You led." No signature. I kept it tucked inside my locker. Hidden but close. It reminded me that someone, maybe a shipmate, maybe a mentor, had seen me when my own family refused to. That anonymous note carried me through long watches and harder days. And then came news that would force me back toward the very people who had cast me out. The call came just after midnight. A chaplain's voice breaking the quiet hum of my quarters. My father had suffered a heart attack. He was stable, but in critical care at a hospital back home. My mother had asked them to notify me because, as she admitted, she didn't have my current number. For a long moment, I sat in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, unsure whether I felt anger, fear, or nothing at all. By dawn, I'd requested emergency leave. My commanding officer didn't ask questions, just signed the papers, and told me to take the time I needed. I packed one bag, crisp uniform folded inside, and boarded a flight east. The closer the plane carried me to Alabama, the tighter my chest felt. I hadn't set foot there since the night they threw me out. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and sleep deprivation. I walked them with measured steps, boots echoing against tile, until I reached his room. My mother answered the door. Her shoulders were smaller, her hair grayer, but her eyes still darted away from mine. "He's sleeping," she whispered. I stood at the foot of his bed, staring at the man who had once called me worthless. Wires and monitors replaced his sharp commands. He looked diminished, but not defeated. When his eyes flickered open the next morning, the first words he rasped were, "Lieutenant Chavez." Still playing soldier, I didn't storm out. I didn't raise my voice. I sat in the chair beside him, arms folded. "You called me a reject. You threw me out. Do you even remember that he didn't answer? I went on, quietly but firmly, listing the lives saved, the programs I'd led, the trust I'd earned at sea. He avoided my eyes, staring instead at the IV line. When I rose to leave, he only managed a shallow breath. Rest up, I said. I'll check in tomorrow. And I did. Each day after, I returned in uniform, not for closure, not for reconciliation, but because some part of me needed to see the distance between who I was then and who I'd become. On the fourth morning of my visits, he was sitting upright, a tray of untouched broth in front of him. His hands shook slightly, but his eyes held mine longer than before. Didn't expect you'd come back again, he said, voice gravelly. Didn't think I would either, I admitted. The silence stretched. Finally, he shifted, shoulders heavy against the pillows. I was angry. Thought you were wasting your life. The Navy never made sense to me. His gaze drifted toward the window, where sunlight cut through blinds in fractured lines. Then, quieter. But I saw the video, the one of the rescue. You didn't just make it. You led. It wasn't an apology, not really. But it was the closest he'd ever come. And for once, I let myself accept it. When he was released from the hospital days later, I chose not to stay for the awkward celebration. I returned to my ship, to the hum of engines and the steady rhythm of duty. The sea didn't ask for forgiveness. It only asked for presence. That was something I could give without hesitation. Weeks later, during an international exercise, our destroyer responded to a drifting vessel. At first, it seemed routine, another broken engine, another escort request. But, as our boarding team reported back, the truth chilled me. Dozens of civilians, dehydrated and terrified, hidden in cargo holds, victims of human smuggling. I coordinated the rescue from the bridge, my orders measured and precise, even as my pulse thundered. Food, water, medics, safe transfer. Every decision mattered. By dawn, more than 60 lives had been pulled from darkness into safety. When the captain addressed the crew later, she turned to me in front of everyone. Executive Officer Chavez led this response. Her professionalism saved lives. Take note. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. It settled deep in my chest. News traveled quickly. The Navy issued a press release. Articles appeared, sanitized but clear enough. And then, one evening, a message lit up my phone. It was from my brother. Saw the article. You did good. Dad's been telling everyone at church. He talks about you a lot now. I read it twice, my throat tight. The same man who once called me a lowlife now repeated my name with pride. And yet, for me, the real victory wasn't his recognition. It was standing there, uniform crisp, knowing I hadn't needed it to begin with. When I finally walked back into my parents' house months later, the walls looked the same: family photos, polished wood floors, the faint smell of lemon polish my mother always used. But I was not the same woman who had been shoved out into the night with a duffel bag. My father stood slowly when I entered, thinner than I remembered, leaning on a cane. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. Then he did something I never thought I'd see. He raised his hand and saluted me. Not mockingly, not out of habit, sincere, steady, almost reverent. I returned the gesture without a word. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't an erasure of the years of silence. It was simply acknowledgement. For him, that was an earthquake. For me, it was enough. We sat in the living room, the same place he had once called me a failure. This time, he admitted in a halting voice, I was wrong about you, wrong about what mattered. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for his hand. I just listened, calm and steady, because I no longer needed his approval to know my worth. When I left that night, I stepped into the warm southern air lighter than I had in years. I had come full circle not to seek permission, not to demand apology, but to close a chapter. The truth is, they once called me a Navy reject. They threw me out, convinced I would disappear. But the sea became my home, the crew my family, and command my compass. Every mile, every mission, every scar proved I wasn't what they said. I had charted my own course. And in the end, that was the only recognition I ever needed.